Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I really hope everybody who's listening, I hope they're doing as fantastic as I am. And Tim, we are going to go beyond Black History Month in this episode, but I want to back that up a little bit. I want to go beyond how I'm doing and into how you're doing. How are you?
I'm doing great today, Lance. Thanks a lot for asking. I am especially great because we speak with a wonderful woman named Femi Redwood. She is a journalist and just a professional, and she produces and hosts the show Beyond Black History Month, which is just fantastic.
It really is, and it delves into Black history all year round. And as she said with a laugh during this conversation, hey, we're still here even when it's not February. And the show goes very deep into the history that you might not know, or you might know, but she applies that to how it's affected the world today. It's amazing. And you will learn something about your culture, about Black history. They pack a punch, and she's so articulate.
And you can find out about Femi at her website. It's femiredwood.me. That's Femi. And you can follow her on social media as well under that same handle.
And speaking of following people on social media, Tim, I feel like this is a great segue to introduce our audience to our social media platforms. Where on earth would they be able to find us?
Well, folks can find us at Crawlspace Podcast or at Crawlspace Pod. We're on YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And we're also doing bonus shows now, Lance, on Crawlspace Premium.
Oh my goodness, I was just about to say we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we'll be back with Femi. But you just mentioned this Crawlspace Premium. Would this be where people go and not hear these sponsors that we speak of?
You got that right. You can get every single episode of Crawlspace ad-free at crawlspace.supportingcast.fm, or folks can now subscribe on Apple Podcasts.
You mentioned this bonus show. I remember in the past, there was this hidden opinion show, and then the Crawlspace bonus show was more about life behind the scenes. Is this some sort of hybrid, or would you say they've been bundled together?
Little of column A, little of column B on that one, Lance. Yeah, we do talk a little bit about life behind the scenes, but we also dig into the cases that we cover here on Crawlspace, but also on Missing. And we also just speak about what life is like back here, upcoming interviews, some behind-the-scenes fun.
And guess what, Tim? It's time to break for those aforementioned sponsors.
See you on the flip side.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast, Femi Redwood. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. You have an amazing show called Beyond Black History Month, which we'll get into, but I want to get something out of the way first. You hate PCs.
I do. I don't understand why we still have them. I don't understand their existence. 20 years ago, sure. Today, why do we have PCs? And now, if this was like 5 or 10 years ago where there was a price difference, then I could understand why you have a PC. But in 2022, 23, and beyond, we don't need PCs. So as of this moment, I am starting a campaign to end PCs. Who is with me?
We're with you.
Awesome. Love it.
The listeners vote early and vote often for the elimination of PCs.
We're starting strong. 3 people is certainly much better than. I have a one-woman protest against a grocery store in my neighborhood. My wife won't even join my protest. So 3 people, I'm already winning here.
I don't understand why some people like swear by them. Like, what is that?
Maybe they're used to it, but yeah, it's just we can do better. We're aiming for better these days.
Yeah.
That's a pro segue into our topic today, aiming better in society.
Yes.
You have an amazing career path. I want to know, and I think the listeners want to know, how did that all get started? Was media always your first goal, your first love?
Yeah, kind of. I say kind of because like a kid, at first I thought I wanted to be an archaeologist because why wouldn't you want to discover Jurassic Park? Once I realized that that is completely unrealistic, there would be no way to bring dinosaurs alive, I realized I had to let that dream go. Needless to say, yeah, for the most part, I always wanted to be a journalist. Growing up, my mom was never a morning person, so she would often still be in the bed in the morning. And one of my father's part-time jobs, because my father, he had his career, but he also had 50 50 million hustles. And one of his hustles was delivering newspapers. And so in the mornings, we would sit around the breakfast table and we would just talk about and debate issues in the news. And I just kind of fell in love with it. So not only was it this way that I was able to connect with my father, but I also just fell in love with news. But even at a young age, I knew that how it was being presented didn't mesh up with me, my life, and the people that I know in my circle. So I went to school for journalism, went to Jackson State University, proud HBCU. We are not going to mention Deion Sanders because I feel a kind of way. So we're moving past that. Proud HBCU grad. But yeah, so I went to Jackson State, then I moved to New York and started my career in TV working behind the scenes where I made a whopping minimum wage, which I think was like $7.45. So I was living the dream, let me tell you. I was also doing every type of hustle to help pay the bills because like who can live off of that in New York? So I started my career in TV, going from behind the scenes to eventually reporting. From reporting, eventually anchoring. I was able to work in amazing local newsrooms, amazing national newsrooms, but over and over, I was just sort of not satisfied, which is how I got to here. So I don't know if we're ready for this part of the story yet.
Your show is Beyond Black History Month,
Yes.
And I remember a while ago seeing a quote from Morgan Freeman saying how much he didn't like Black History Month.
Yes.
Because it just is so dismissive. It's like the shortest month.
Yes.
It's one of those things where you provide a little bit and you say, there, we did it.
Exactly.
So what's the origin of your show?
Yeah, so it was literally that. And it's funny because before I get into the origins, let me say that when I was talking to my friends about the show, one specific friend, and I told him the name and I told him the concept, and he was like, ugh, I don't feel like another Black history story. He's like, it's the same thing. It's always Malcolm X, MLK, Harriet Tubman, these same snippets that we've been taught for years, but never really being taught anything new or never really going beyond that surface level. So when I came over here to my current station, 1010 Wins, in WCBS News Radio 880, and I spoke to the brand manager about what it was that I wanted to do. So I manage this department, but I also have this podcast. And one thing that was really important to me was being able to amplify these voices that we so rarely get a chance to hear in journalism. Most journalists don't look like me. Most journalists don't have my background, which means most journalists are covering stories that they connect to in the same way I cover stories that I connect to. And so I made it clear that I wanted to tell stories that would amplify these marginalized voices, but also in a very, very inclusive way. And so, we talked it out, we fleshed it out, and that's how Beyond Black History Month was born. But going back to that conversation that I had with my friend, and this is one of the things that we aim to do in the podcast, is I did an episode on Harriet Tubman, and I learned things about Harriet Tubman that I didn't know, because in all the years of schooling, the things that we were taught about her, some of them were completely untrue. Like, I didn't know that she was disabled. She was hit in the head when she was a young child, and so she would have what they called sleeping spells back then. But despite all of that, she was still just this badass. I'm not sure if I can curse. Hopefully I can curse. But she was just this badass. I never knew that. And so that's one of the things that the podcast tries to do, is not just amplify voices that you don't hear on a regular basis, but also tell those snippets of stories that we just didn't get taught during those 28 days out of the month. And year round, because, Black people do exist year round. I will be here in March, April, May, and every other month.
I'm going to hold up a newspaper now to prove that this is December. You're here.
Exactly. Right. I am here. This is not February.
Well, the show is fantastic. You do a great job on it, and you reference your team. Just like to ask, who's on your team?
Yes, I am so lucky to have an amazing team that I am so obsessed with. One of our producers is Jill Webb. She is just this little fireball that's kind of quiet, but the girl can just write phenomenally. Dempsey Palat, who's another one of the producers, he is our digital mastermind, from web copy to thinking about social and tweets, because we all know that's certainly a big part of any podcast. And then Andy Eganthorpe, who is our audio engineer and just a mastermind behind a lot of the music. Again, fleshing out this podcast and what I wanted to do, music was so important to me because music is a part of Black culture. We love music. It's just our experiences, our stories. And so he was able to, every episode, craft different music because I kind of wanted that feel. Remember New York Undercover back in the day, that TV show that was like Law and Order, but New York based and a lot of hip hop elements. It starred Malik Yoba.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of wanted that, but in a news podcasty form where every episode, it's different music, a different mood, because every story is going to be different.
Speaking of music, one of your recent episodes, you interviewed Daryl McDaniels from Run DMC. You sounded like you were keeping your S together for that, but how are you not losing it? I mean, that's a legend.
I mean, legend is an understatement. This man is just, when you think about Run DMC and everything they were able to do, their music that just cross genres, their style, which is still like, I cannot wait to get a thick gold chain. I told my wife that's what I want for Christmas. I don't care that we are not in the 80s. I want a thick gold chain. She's not going to get it for me, but alas, it is what it is. But yeah, I mean, talk about an icon, but he is just so incredibly sweet. And that's one of the other things that I really enjoy about this series is we've got these people that we just look up to, that we grew up with, that impacted the culture in some kind of way. And then to be able to meet them, it's like, is this real? I'm working on a series for the anniversary of hip hop. Next year is the 50-year anniversary, 2023. And I'm going through all of the list of people that I'm going to reach out to and interview. And literally, I just get goosebumps thinking about like, oh my God, I may be able to chat with Little Kim. And yes, I said little, but I may be able to chat with Lil Kim. Just gets me very, very excited. And that's why I feel so incredibly lucky to be able to do what I do. This is seriously a dream. I would not have thought this would be happening when I was in like, I don't know, anchoring in Flint, Michigan, and just trying to figure out how I'm going to get sound about whatever random story I was working on.
And I think one of the more important things about an episode like that with Daryl is that you're talking about something that is another interest of his with the comics and comic books. And I was trying to figure out a way to ask this question. I don't want to sound like insulting or anything like that, but is that part of your process, or is that part of your goal to have people like him on who are iconic in music? And as a Black man, do you think it's harder for people to accept that he might be interested in something that is generally like in the white world?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. And it's interesting because when I spoke to a couple different Black comic fans, they all kind of say the same thing, that because the comic book industry is seen as this very like white nerdy thing, sometimes people can't imagine, you know, a Black man who's like 6'1" with grills being into this. Not Daryl, but someone else. But yeah, and that was the other thing that was so interesting is he was able to talk about how in so many ways, despite the fact that there is this belief that this is a world that is a very white world and that it's only for, you know, white men, despite that, the comic industry is so similar to the rap industry. And I didn't even know going into the story that that would be the story. Truth be told, when I initially approached him, it was just to get an interview about the work he's doing in comics. You know, Daryl makes comics. You're doing a Comic-Con episode. Why not speak to him? But when I listened back to the interview, you know, when after you like take a step back and listen to it, the one theme that kept coming in over and over and over was how similar it was to rap. And so one of the points he made was about alter egos. So, you know, if you are a Marvel fan like I am, you know, Tony Stark, Iron Man, Peter Parker, Spider-Man, they're all of these alter egos. And that was the same thing that he created in rap. And the same thing that a lot of rappers create. They create oftentimes this alter ego, entertainers in general. And that's just one of the many ways that it's similar with comics. And then also when you think of the art of telling a story, whether or not you are crafting words on a piece of paper and then putting the images on top of it, that's kind of the same as crafting words in a rap song. And then you listen to, like, think about some of your favorite rap songs. Those are stories. just like comic books. It's just a different type of story.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
I love that.
I really loved your episode on Black Twitter and the digital grapevine. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the things, and again, this is another episode where I didn't think it was going to go where it went. Back when I was in TV, there's a conference every year or an organization called the National Association of Black Journalists. And they have this big conference every year where thousands of journalists come. And I'd say about 5 or 6 years ago, I remember someone from MSNBC saying that the story you're sent out on may not be the story you get. So thinking back in terms of a newsroom, when you are in that newsroom meeting at the beginning of your day and your executive producer says, hey, I'm going to have you do a story on this fire. And you get to the fire and you realize that's not the story. The story is about how this little boy woke up out of his sleep and emptied out the entire building. That's the story. And so I use that same belief when I go into podcasts. I may start off thinking the story is one thing, but once I get into the story, I realize it's completely different. So that episode was actually supposed to be on Black colleges. But as I was talking to Henry Louis Gates, and he kept talking about how Twitter is so similar to the ways that our ancestors used to communicate during slavery. So, whether or not it was the songs that they used to do, sing some of their movements that would communicate things that they couldn't vocally say out loud. And that's kind of what Twitter has become, and Black Twitter, this sort of grapevine of how Black folks are able to communicate their ideas, communicate their thoughts in ways that you might not be able to do at work. And if I'm being completely honest, in ways that you couldn't really do like 15 years ago. And that's like one of the great things about Twitter is it makes you realize, especially when you're of a marginalized identity, but it makes you realize that you're not crazy. There are other things that like other people are doing, seeing, and experiencing that is just like you. So one of my favorite, every once in a while on Twitter, you see these threads come up about like either like Black sayings you grew up with or things you find in a Black household. And every time one of these threads come up, I'm always surprised still that there are things that other people were doing that we were also doing. So for example, ginger ale and saltines. I don't know why my people thinks that will make you somehow better, but I will swear on it until the day I die. If you are sick, you get yourself some ginger ale and you get yourself some saltines. My grandmother, she's since passed, but she lived in Florida, this small community called Apalachicola. And she had this tin cookie box that in all of my years, I've never seen cookies in. It's always like sewing supplies and like all of these random things. And it's like that in so many Black households. And so that's, some of the elements that we tried to include in the episode because, again, going back to how it is this digital grapevine that helps people communicate. But what does that look like now? At first, when Elon Musk took over Twitter, I kept hearing stories about like people saying, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And to be completely frank, I assumed a lot of it was BS. I assumed a lot of it was people overreacting. But seriously, for the first time ever, I had to have a producer pull down one of our tweets because it was just filled with so much racism. And there were other people, some of the guests that we spoke to were tagged on the tweets, and I didn't want to make them subject to that type of language. I'm used to it after being in TV, whatever, but I didn't want them to have to deal with it. So for the first time, we had to pull down a tweet because it was just bad. And so in researching the episode, that's when I realized it wasn't just me. Hate speech on Twitter had gone up like 500%. So yeah, it was just a really interesting way of highlighting this important network because there's still some people that don't understand the value of social media, but a way of highlighting this very important network while also putting it into a historical context of why this matters.
Right. There was an article released, I think it was last week in the New York Times about hate speech on Twitter since Elon took over, and you totally scooped the New York Times with your, reporting in that episode. It was pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. It was, honestly, it was surprising for me. I did not expect it, even though, especially trans folks had been warning us that, hey, this is going to happen. Society has a way of, often with marginalized voices, society has a way of not believing folks. And so trans folks said flat out that, hey, this is going to happen, but I didn't believe it until I saw it with my own eyes.
Yeah, and I think actually Elon put out graphs of the opposite before that article was released. Pretty clear that there's a problem there since he took over.
Right. No, it definitely got worse. But yeah, there's a reason why advertisers were leaving the platform. I hope they figure it out because I love Twitter. I've tried to use some of the other things that people were going to, but like Mastodon, it's a lot of work. It's too much. There was another one I think called like Black Twitter or something. Twitter just needs to get it together. Plain and simple. Get it together.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Do you think that it's more dangerous to have society unaware of this hate speech, hate crimes, systemic racism, all of these things that currently exist? Because back a few years ago, 10 years ago, things seemed cool. Things seemed like we were on the right path. And then all of these other things started coming up, and then it was minute by minute, there was something happening, and it was disturbing to realize that it was always there, just under the surface. So do you think it's more dangerous to have it be under the surface, or do you think it's more dangerous for the way it is now, where it keeps coming up, and people are getting a little bit more brazen with their hate speech, and a lot more brazen with just outright attacks? Or doesn't it matter? Does it have to be this way?
Well, I hope it doesn't have to be this way because, my God, that's depressing.
Right.
I think it depends. When it's not spoken about, when people don't know how much hate exists, that allows people to live in a bubble. So then you hear things like, oh, well, people today complain about da 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 da. It's not that people today are only now starting to complain about these things. It's just now that people either feel empowered to, or through spaces like Twitter, they realize they're not alone in these feelings. But that's the danger of it being hidden, is people think there's not a problem. Okay. Here's an example. Certainly not hate speech, but when you talk about like anti-Blackness, looking at it from the beauty standard, right? So I remember back in 6th grade, it was me and a white girl in my class, and she said something like, let's go to everyone and find out who they think is the prettiest. And I said to her, well, no, because I'm Black, and here in Delaware, in this predominantly white class, they're all going to say you're the prettiest because you're white and everyone else is white. So I say that to say that, like, even back then, I knew that there was this idea of this almost like very Eurocentric beauty standard. Think about what the beauty standard was for Black women, especially in like the 90s. It was the straight, relaxed hair, weave down to your back. And listen, I'm wearing a wig, so I am not like anti-weave, anti-wig, but it was this very like Eurocentric style. Whereas like you fast forward to today and you see more Black women embracing their natural hair. And so you then see legislation coming out saying prevent Black women from being penalized for wearing braids and other natural hairstyles. And so some of the comments that you may see in some of these postings, or, you may see people saying on TV is, well, why does this matter? Why do they want to wear their hair like this now? There were all these decades where they were doing this. And I say all that to say, because it wasn't spoken about, because that anti-Blackness was sort of under the surface, people didn't realize that it did affect people back then. We just weren't talking about it. You asked whether or not it was better where it's hidden or better now, where it's out in the open. And this is why I say it depends, because while certainly people are emboldened to act out in a way that we haven't seen in years. I mean, just think back even last weekend, 2 different instances where Proud Boys or Proud Boy-like folks showed up at drag queen shows to try and intimidate and prevent the shows. One that happened in Staten Island, and I think the other one was in Ohio. So when you see more of it, it's certainly like energizes people to think, hey, I can commit these atrocities, or I can do this because I'm seeing other people do it. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't publicize it. Whenever there's a shooter, it's let's not talk about it too much because then we're going to give someone else the idea to be a mass shooter. If you're a whack job and you want to shoot a bunch of people, it doesn't matter whether or not you see it on TV. You're going to shoot a bunch of people. If you're a whack job and you are anti-Semitic or you're anti-Black or you're anti-gay, you're going to still be anti all of those things. You're just now going to be empowered to act on it. So that's why I say it kind of depends on how you want to look at it. But it is all trash. It is just all trash, plain and simple.
Well said. I really enjoy having guests on that will answer a question that was thought up in the moment, and you answered it so like articulately, and it gave me a much better picture of what that idea was in my head. So I appreciate that. It was a great answer.
Thank you. No, it's a good question, and it's the type of things that like we've got to talk about more often. And I can go on and on and on about this, but so often we tend to shy away from uncomfortable conversations. And so there's never any change. Like we've got to get into the discomfort, like just like do it.
Hey, that's what Crawlspace is all about, Femi.
I love it.
We love getting uncomfortable. You made an episode about a shortage of Black sperm donors.
Yeah.
And how that hurts lesbian and queer families. Can you explain this problem that I had no idea about?
Before I explain it, I'm going to point out reason number 5011 of why I hate PCs. You see how it now has finally decided to go black behind me? Reason number 5011.
It was on a 26-minute timer.
Exactly. Super random. Whatever. Stupid PCs. Okay. Yes. This episode was actually one that I really, really cared about because I'm trying to have children. My wife and I have already decided we are going to live a child-free existence. We are the fun aunties with no kids. That is our role in life. But yeah, no, it was something that was really important to me and one that I'd actually been trying to tell this story for the past couple of years. Some years ago, I met a queer couple, trans man and a cis woman, who were married and they wanted to have kids. They were both African American. They wanted their child to not just be Black, but also African American. They wanted to have that shared ethnicity with their child, but they couldn't. They looked seriously for 8 years. They tried to find sperm for 8 years, but just couldn't because as soon as sperm would be available, it would then be gone. So for folks that don't know, most cryobanks, they have almost like an online database where you can go in and you set the parameters of what it is you're looking for. So 5'7", Asian race, maybe Japanese ethnicity, blue eyes, whatever. You put in whatever it is that you're looking for. The problem is whenever Black sperm would go on these databases, they would sell out in a matter of seconds. There was such a dramatic shortage of Black sperm. And so obviously this affected everyone across the board, cis couples, single mothers by choice, but just because of the demographics of folks who go to a cryobank, predominantly lesbian and queer couples, it affected them the most. And then obviously Black women who were then looking for sperm where their child would look like them. And so as I started interviewing several people just doing research in this story, the one thing that I kept finding is that oftentimes what would end up happening is Black women would just give up. So they would either go with a donor who might be a person of color. And so then it's just like trying to gauge how dark they are. But a lot of women would just give up because they can't find their sperm. Eventually the body's going to do what the body's going to do. You can wait, but so long. And so that's why this story was just so important for me to tell. And so what we did, in addition to introducing folks to this one lesbian, her and her wife had been looking for sperm for a couple of years. Now, granted, they also had some, reproductive challenges, which is also something that's not really spoken about in Black communities. I also wanted to dig into the why. Why does this issue exist? And we found out a couple of different things, but there's the obvious, Black men aren't donating. Okay, well, why aren't they donating? And so from there, I was just getting into it. There's an uncomfortable relationship between Black communities and the healthcare system. There was that study that came out a couple of years ago showing the medical racism. Like I don't remember the exact stat. I want to say like 27% of doctor residents, so, they're well into their training, believed that Black folks literally had thicker skin than whites. Part of the reason why the opioid crisis initially impacted Black communities differently is because doctors weren't giving drugs to Black folks because they automatically assumed they were going to abuse it. And then also the belief that Black people can tolerate pain, a higher amount of pain than white folks can. So all of these different things that just creates this tension between the two. And then you get into, the maternal mortality rate is so much higher for Black women. I mean, here in New York City, I think it's 9 times higher for Black women than it is for white women. So needless to say, there's this fraught relationship between the two. So that's one reason why men aren't donating. There are these requirements that cryobanks have. Cryobank customers say, this is what our customers want. Our customer wants someone who is college educated, da-da-da-da-da. We know through systemic challenges, systemic barriers, that Black folks are not going to have That's going to be one of those challenges, looking for someone who has a degree versus someone who doesn't have a degree. Marketing was one of the biggest reasons that they said this issue exists, because the places that they market at aren't necessarily places where you'll find Black community members. So they might go to a rock climbing gym versus putting up a poster saying, hey, we need donors in a barbershop. You think back on the civil rights movement, barbershops and hair salons, that's where Black communities galvanized at. Those are communal, important spaces to our community. So why wouldn't those posters be in those locations as well? A lot of times where the banks are located are in very white communities. So they might go to a college campus to recruit, but these aren't HBCUs. So that means you're going to get a smaller percentage of Black men because these are predominantly white institutions. But then even that, and this is why I say it goes back to marketing, because even location wasn't the biggest challenge, because there was one cryobank in Atlanta. Atlanta is a very Black city, but this cryobank in Atlanta, it still only had very few Black donors. And this is like a very Black city. So basically the whole gist of it is it wasn't even just location. It was the way the stuff is being marketed, in addition to just this deeply ingrained mistrust of the medical system within Black communities. Don't even get me started like the Tuskegee Project. It's just so much there that needs to be fixed. And then what happens is it trickles down into all of these other aspects like sperm donation.
I was actually going to ask you a question about the Tuskegee Project when you said that. So we can do that at another episode.
Sometimes we forget that these separate issues contribute to all of these other issues. And when you look at like medical bias and implicit racism, it then trickles into something like a couple being able to find a donor to have a child that looks like the family they were raised in.
And then if they do have a child, it's almost impossible for that child, when they turn old enough to vote, to actually find a place to vote.
Right.
Every step of the way, there's like some roadblock that is a giant challenge.
Yeah, it is one thing after the next. Don't even get me started on the amount of polling sites that have closed and da-da-da-da. Now you're going to be here for like 3 hours as I talk about that.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor. Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
We had mentioned that we cover a lot of missing person cases, missing person stories, and cold cases, and we focus a lot on marginalized communities and why the media handles those stories different from a more white perspective. And we see it all the time with individuals who are missing, and it becomes this media sensation. And then in the meantime, there's 100 of marginalized people who are in trouble, missing, unsolved murders, etc. How do you handle that, being in the industry yourself?
Yeah, it's funny as you say that. I instantly think back on when I was an anchor in Flint, there was a child who went missing. So Flint is a predominantly Black community, and there was a child who went missing from one of the apartment complexes in Flint. And the producer was trying to determine whether or not to put it in the show. So for those who don't know, the way the show typically works, or any like local news broadcast works, you've got a producer that will decide what they'll put in the show, and then the anchors will also contribute and like, hey, I think they should go in da-da-da-da-da. And so I'm working on something else, but I'm observing a conversation where the producer and my co-anchor is talking about whether or not to put this missing child in the show. And the producer was inexperienced, so she relied a lot on me and my co-anchor. And my co-anchor says to her, he was a white man, but he says to her, oftentimes these are just runaways, so I don't think it's worth putting in the show because, they're just a runaway. To which I said, well, we don't know what they are. At that point, it's like, take off my headphones and like, whoa, we don't know what they are. We do need to put it in the show because da-da-da-da-da. But that literally explains what the issue is. So often when Black children or teenagers go missing, the initial thought from many in media is, this is just a runaway. And it goes back to the ways that you think about, again, this implicit bias that so many people carry. So you think about the ways that, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but there were studies that came out that showed that people tend to think Black girls are older than they are. They tend to think Black boys are older than they are. And so it goes back to the ways in which like children in our community are perceived as not being innocent. There was always something else. So when a Black child goes missing, it's, well, what did they do? They must have run away, not this poor child went missing. And then we see the same thing when it comes to adults. They just don't get Black women, Black teenage women they don't get the attention of white women when they go missing. Some of it undeniably goes to, there's this thing where we connect to stories of which we are most similar. If I see a story about a book about a Black little girl growing up and the white little girl growing up, I'm naturally going to gravitate towards the Black girl because I see myself in this little girl. And this is a problem with there not being diversity in a lot of our newsrooms. When so much of the newsroom doesn't look like me, they're not even realizing that there's a problem. So they're not even realizing that, like, wait a minute, this story of this Black missing woman should get the same amount of attention as the story of the white woman, missing woman. And that's one thing that, thinking back on Gabby Petito, if there was one thing that came out of that gave me joy, it was that you heard this conversation more about how Black missing women and white missing women are treated completely different. Missing white woman syndrome is what it was called. But you heard people talking about it in ways that I had never seen in my career. And even the Petito family, if I'm not mistaken, they even spoke out on the fact that, like, hey, there's also Black women missing. I want to help. Like, we're going to help, amplify some of these stories. Yeah, there's a massive issue with just those stories being ignored, but it's similar with other stories about marginalized communities being ignored. Trans stories, queer stories, Black stories, the list goes on. I mentioned NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists. I'm the co-chair of their LGBTQ task force, and I'm a board member of NOGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists. And often I will have these panels or lead these conversations about some of the ways that reporters contribute to misinformation, even when not intentional, and just the more ethical ways of reporting stories. And one thing that I often get across, or that I often say, is we've got to, as an industry, stop treating police as gods. And what I mean by that is what police are telling you is what this imperfect human is telling you. It doesn't mean it's fact just because police have told you that. So just because police say to a reporter, yeah, it's probably a runaway, doesn't mean it's a runaway. Just because a police says to a reporter, yeah, well, there are some things in the criminal history. Okay, well, what are some of the things? Was it like stealing a candy bar? Like, that has no bearing on this person being a victim. So I say all that to say that oftentimes, too, the other issue with these types of stories and Black folks not having their voices amplified is the narrative that police create in the beginning is typically the narrative that just continues until the story gets to the investigative level, God knows how many days, weeks, or months later. I often in these panels, I challenge reporters to think about the way that they are getting information from police, but also how they're then distributing that information, because that narrative ends up shaping so much in the story. That makes a big difference in whether or not an entire community is going to then walk through the woods and comb the ground looking for someone. And so it kind of starts with the reporting.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We have this conversation a lot about the misinformation that's out there, and coming in as podcasters, what we do is we source this information, and this information could be a decade old or 15 years old. If law enforcement at the time of this incident reported it one way, and it's wrong, right, or slightly inaccurate, or there's something about it that doesn't ring true, no one fixes that.
Right.
There's so much unintentional misinformation that is being put out there, and we get called out on it. We apologize. We try to do our best to right the ship.
No, we say it was the reporter's fault.
Blaming the reporter. No, it's interesting. So we're working on a true crime podcast that'll launch in 2023. And so obviously we're going through all of the newspaper.com archives. And you see it. I'm thinking of one story in particular where the few articles that were written, because we're also looking at all stories, but a lot of marginalized stories as well. But you look at some of the articles that were written 3 decades ago. And then when you talk to officers now, they're like, yeah, that actually wasn't true. But it was that one narrative. It just kept going.
It's tough. And it's even tougher now because the information's out there and 5 minutes later, I feel like such an old person when I say this, but it is true. 5 minutes later, another piece of information comes out about something else that will grab people's attention, and no one goes back to fix the other thing.
Yeah, listen, here's a podcast idea that I think would make a lovely podcast, and maybe there's already this podcast out there, but how much would you love a podcast that went back and looked at all of the things that we got wrong? We were told this about this story. Here's what really happened. Going back to this past weekend, the blackouts in North Carolina, granted, no one reported on this. This was only like social media, but a lot of the social media chatter was that it was an organized attack on some of the substations to prevent a drag show from happening. I have no idea if that's true, but how great would it be if in like a year someone covered that and was like, hey, this is what happened. Either it did have something to do with this or it didn't. But yeah, there's a free podcast idea. Someone take it and run with it.
It's a good idea. Yeah. I was wondering about that story too, because I saw that that reporting, and I didn't follow up to see if it was accurately reported anywhere.
I don't think anything came out about it. I looked again, like I think on like Monday, and then literally like you said, I kind of forgot about it and moved on to the next thing. I am a part of the problem.
Well, it's the fractured media landscape.
Right.
What is coming up in 2023 for Beyond Black History Month?
Yes, a series on hip hop. 2023 is the 50-year anniversary of hip hop, even though hip hop was actually born before 50 years, but whatever. So we're doing a series on that. We're looking at a couple different things from not just the founding, but women in hip hop, the business of hip hop. So I'm so excited about that. As much of a hip hop fan as I am learning new things every day, but also talking to everyone is sort of putting me on a memory lane where I'm now listening to albums that I haven't listened to for years. Like this morning, it was all about the Fugees. Like this morning was a Fugees morning. So that's one of the things I'm really excited about for next year. Another thing that I'm so excited about. So a little bit of background on me. My father's African-American. My mom is Jamaican. Born in Miami, lived in South Carolina, then Delaware, then Mississippi, New York, everywhere. But when my mom came over here, she fell in love with this island in South Carolina called St. Helena Island. It's one of the barrier islands between Charleston and Savannah. And St. Helena is home to the Gullah people. Gullah people were a group of African-Americans, or are, because they're certainly alive, but a group of African-Americans that held on to a lot of those West African traditions longer than other groups of African Americans in the country. And they were able to hold on to so many of their traditions because, number one, these barrier islands, all of these small islands, so they're just naturally more insular compared to other communities, but also number two, when the U.S. banned folks from bringing over Africans, when they said, okay, you cannot bring over any more Africans to be slaves, you can keep slavery, but just don't bring anyone over. In the Carolinas, because there was all of the wetlands, because they could circumvent officials, they were able to continue bringing over folks from Africa. So because of that, whereas like there may have been, I don't know, let's say a 50-year difference between folks in New York City getting, anyone from West Africa, they were still getting them in South Carolina. So because of that, this group of people held on to so many of these West African traditions. So in the island my parents live in, it is the Gullah people. Other islands, it's Geechee people. Needless to say, when my mom came over here, she fell in love with the island because, number one, it reminded her so much of a certain group in Jamaica, the Maroon people, Mountain people in Jamaica. It reminded her of them because their accents sounded very similar. Their cultures were very similar. And so she just fell in love with this because it reminded her of home. So needless to say, all these years later, this culture is still very deep in many of those barrier islands. And so I've got 2 episodes on just the history of the Gullah people, but also the gentrification that they're facing. A lot of family land there, land that had been in their family since the end of slavery. But, considering it is a lot of these are island communities, beach communities, property values have gone up, taxes have gone up. So a lot of families end up losing their lands every year. So there was actually an auction. They do an auction every year. And I went to the auction this past year and they literally tell you at the auction, it's a land auction. They literally tell you, hey, if we say something is heirs property, please don't bid on it because that means it has been in this family for generations. It has been there since the end of slavery. Don't bid on this land. But of course, you see people bidding on this land because they are horrible human beings. So needless to say, there's just a lot of gentrification happening on the island. So it's a story that I am so in love with. My parents ended up moving back to South Carolina. I have property down there because it's just something about that land. It just connects me to ancestors that I don't need. My people not even from there, but who knows? Maybe they are. I don't know. But there's just something about that place that is so special. So that is another episode I am very excited about. It's going to be 2 episodes. And it's just so interesting, so good. So good.
Can't wait to hear about that because it's, again, being introduced to new things like that and learning new things is so fun and so important.
Agreed.
You said you had a connection to that land, and that reminded me when we spoke earlier that you have a connection to Flint, Michigan.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your experience in Flint.
Yeah. So, you know what's funny? So, I was a reporter in New York City before going to Flint. I moved to Flint to be an anchor. Also, for folks who don't know, the way it typically works in TV is your goal is to work your way up in markets to be in a top market. New York is considered the number one market. Chicago is like number 4. LA, I think, is number 2. Atlanta's like number 11. And Flint, Michigan is like number 76. So, I went from the number one market as a reporter to number 76 as an anchor. And the one thing everyone kept saying is, why in the world are you going to Flint? In addition to its water issues, you're also leaving the place that most people work their way to. But I wanted to go, number one, because I wanted the anchoring experience and I wasn't going to get it in New York. But also, number 2, I wanted to go because in a weird way, I fell in love with Flint because it kind of reminded me of Brooklyn. It reminded me of the Caribbean communities and Black communities in Brooklyn. And why I say that is Flint has gone through all of these horrible, horrible things, you know, when the auto industry left and that completely took so much money out of the community, when white flight happened and so much of the tax base left. And then there's the water crisis. So all these things happened, but every day, mothers and fathers are getting up, they are getting their kids to school, and they are hoping for more. They are pushing their kids for more. They are continuing to fight for their communities. And it just reminded me so much of Black communities here in New York City that are doing the same thing, that they are fighting so that their child has a better life than they had. And so I just fell in love with it in a very weird way that you would not expect. So much of Brooklyn I found in Flint, and not even Brooklyn. Honestly, I think so much of Blackness and that togetherness was found in Flint. And that's honestly a big way of how the community was able to continue to exist and grow all these years later. They relied on each other because they certainly weren't getting assistance from the state. I mean, even when you think about like the water donations, once the state stopped doing things, it was still the churches that were passing out water. But yeah, they really relied on each other in such a way that I just found so beautiful. I wanted to not only be witness to it, but get a chance to tell some of their stories. And then the other thing too that made me fall in love with Flint is if there was ever a need for good journalists, that's what the community of Flint deserved. And I'm not saying that I am like the end all be all of journalists, but like they deserve someone to tell their stories. And I was like, I'm going to be that person for 2 years. And then I'm coming back to New York City to be with my wife. Honestly, Flint was great. Flint was great in ways that I would have just never imagined. And other thing, Captain Morgan and Diet Coke in Flint, $3.85. $3.85.
Not bad.
$3.85. My God.
Maybe they should charge a little bit more for that.
I mean, I guess they could, but I don't want them to. Yeah, no, it was great.
I suppose it's safer to drink than the water.
Exactly. And here's the thing. So in theory, they say the water is fine. And this goes back to everything that we've spoken about. The building that I lived in a building downtown. And so the pipes downtown, because that's where most of the money was, let's be completely honest, those pipes were replaced first. And so the building I was in was supposed to have good water, but I didn't trust it. And that's the thing. When trust is broken, it's so hard to get back. It is so hard to get back. So my entirety of the time there, I only drank bottled water. I remember there was one morning when I ran out of water and I needed to make coffee. I had a bag of ice, so I melted ice to use in my water because, again, once trust is broken, it is hard to get it back.
And I think what you said there about the community supporting each other and fighting for each other and wanting better for the next generation, I think a lot of communities could take a page from Flint's book there and do the same. Too many communities are just crumbling. We spoke about a missing man in an area of this country. I was on Street View and I just couldn't get over what I was looking at. When you let communities go, it's really depressing.
Yes.
It has a really huge negative impact economically for everybody else.
It really does. That's one of the things going back to even, St. Helena Island, where my parents are. I spent maybe like 2 months there during the pandemic, a month, somewhere around there, somewhere between a month or two there. You saw farmers delivering boxes of food to folks. You saw communities basically getting food from grocery stores and having like weekly distributions, but that community really and truly came together. And then you compared it with other communities where, people were lying and saying they were a teacher to get a vaccine. The Equinox Fitness woman, I don't know if you remember, who lied and said she was a teacher to get the vaccine and she was a spin instructor. Yeah, you see the difference.
That doesn't count?
Sadly, it does not count. Or rather, if that counts, then me sitting here counts as me working out. Me like moving my hands is me lifting weights.
It says instructor. If it says instructor, you should be fine.
Your line of thinking, I think I'm going to have to just like have you with me everywhere. When my wife says you have not got on the Peloton for over a month, I need you to say something back to her.
Well, what's it there for if you're not going to get on it?
Okay. Reason number 5,000.
It just popped back up.
What is this? What is this? Death to PCs. Death to PCs.
My goodness. Well, I have a great idea for a segment for your show for next year. In February, turn the tables, and you're going to have White History Month in February.
Oh, so you and every Twitter troll. That's exactly. When is White History Month? Yeah.
Turn the tables, and no one's going to see it coming. And you'll be like, see, how does it feel?
And then do you remember how, and whenever there's like the BET Awards, you always see on social media, when is just the white person's award? Why can't we just have, like, really, guy? Alas.
That was a joke I wrote down with a big question mark. So I'm glad that went over. I'm glad it landed okay.
I knew where you were going with it. I knew where you were going. Again, because I guarantee you, in fact, let's put money on it. How many of these do we see coming up on Twitter or TikTok come February?
We doing an over-under?
Ooh, yes. I'm here for it.
Jeez, I don't know. What, like 50? Is that a fair over-under number?
You know what? You go with 50. I am about to rake it in.
So you're taking the over. Okay.
You're taking the over.
Well, Femi, this has been amazing speaking with you here today. We really appreciate your time, and your show is incredible. Please keep trucking with it. And the logo is absolutely beautiful. Like, I know we spoke about that offline. One of the best logos I think I've ever seen in the podcast landscape. Congrats on the show and everything.
Thank you. This is so much fun.